The first shot echoed across the Black Hills as Lone Wolf watched the smoke from the rifles rise in greyish spirals. He stood motionless under the shade of a century-old pine tree, his dark eyes following the movement of American Army troops on the plain below. 23 warriors from his tribe had died in the previous week, including his youngest brother. That spring day in 1868 marked the 9th month since Colonel James Harrington arrived in South Dakota with orders to pacify the Lakota. Lone Wolf adjusted the leather bandana that held back his long black hair and slipped silently between the rocks. The practice of hunting had made him a ghost in the forest. At 26 years old, he was respected among his people as one of the best trackers, but his heart carried the weight of a war that seemed to have no end. They continue to advance on our sacred lands, he thought, watching the column of soldiers marching towards the newly built fort. At the opposite end of the valley, Catherine Russell adjusted her skirts as she stepped off the stagecoach at Fort Abraham Lincoln. The merciless sun beat down on her fair skin, and she quickly opened her lace parasol. At 22, the young teacher from Boston had accepted her Aunt Martha's invitation to spend the summer in the West Country, far from the tumult of society that had suffocated her since the death of her parents. "Kathy, thank God you arrived safe and sound," exclaimed Martha Russell, crossing the fort's dusty courtyard. "We had news of yet another Indian attack on the main road." Catherine hugged her aunt, smelling the familiar scent of lavender that always accompanied her. "The trip was peaceful, Aunt. Just long and hot," he replied, observing the movement around him. Fort Abraham Lincoln was buzzing with activity. Soldiers marched in formation, traders unloaded carts of supplies, and women chatted under the shadows of wooden buildings. To Catherine, everything seemed simultaneously chaotic and fascinating. "Colonel Harrington is looking forward to meeting you," Martha commented as they walked to the commander's house. "He rarely has the opportunity to talk to a polite young woman from the East." Catherine smiled politely, but her interest was in the distant mountains that dotted the horizon. There was something about those wild lands that called to her in a way Boston never had. "Our scouts have reported Lakota movement in the hills to the north," Colonel Harrington declared, spreading a map on the oak desk in his office. "We need to act quickly before they regroup." The officers around him nodded gravely. Among them was Lieutenant William Parker, recently returned from West Point and not yet fully hardened by the realities of the frontier. "Sir, with all due respect," Parker interrupted, "our reports suggest that this specific group did not participate in the recent attacks. Perhaps we could try a diplomatic approach." Harrington looked at the young lieutenant with a mixture of irritation and indulgence. "Parker, you still don't understand how things work in this territory. Savages don't understand diplomacy, only strength." The colonel was an imposing man, with greying moustaches and piercing blue eyes that had seen more battles than he cared to remember. His reputation as an Indian hunter was known throughout the territory, but few knew of his secret agreements with local traders to sell smuggled weapons. "We will attack at dawn," he concluded, dismissing the meeting. Parker left the room with a weight on his chest. At 25, he still believed there was a better way to resolve conflicts with the natives, despite the mockery of his more experienced colleagues. As he walked through the fort's courtyard, he saw Martha Russell, accompanied by a young woman who could only be her newly arrived niece. Something about the girl's elegant posture and curious gaze made him stop momentarily. Catherine felt the lieutenant's gaze and lifted her chin in an almost imperceptible gesture of recognition. There was a gentleness in his eyes that contrasted with the harshness of the other soldiers she had observed since her arrival. That same night, Lone Wolf approached his people's camp with troubling news. The conical tents formed a semicircle sheltered by the trees, with scattered fires illuminating tired but determined faces. "Flying Eagle," he called, approaching the elder chief. The blue-coated soldiers are moving north. Lots of rifles, lots of horses. The old leader nodded silently, the deep lines on his face accentuated by the firelight. Our hunters must leave before dawn. The women and children must take shelter in the caves until it is safe. Looking at his people, the chief continued, "This land has drunk too much Lakota blood. We need wisdom now, not just courage." Lone Wolf watched the families around him, knowing that every decision could mean life or death. His father had been a great warrior who had died trying to protect the sacred lands. Now, that responsibility fell on his shoulders. "I'll follow the soldiers," he finally said. "We need to know your plans before we decide our path." The tension that night spread throughout the territory like a storm brewing on the horizon. At the fort, Catherine lay awake in her small room, listening to the strange sounds of the frontier, the distant howl of a wolf, the neighing of horses in the stalls, the murmur of soldiers on the beat. What she didn't know was that destiny had already drawn invisible lines connecting her life to that of Lone Wolf, the ambitious Colonel Harrington, and the idealistic Lieutenant Parker. South Dakota held secrets that would forever change the course of their lives. At dawn, when the first bugle call sounded throughout the fort, the wheel of fate was already in motion, leading everyone to an inevitable confrontation in the sacred Black Hills. The dawn light had barely begun to spread when Lone Wolf slipped between the rocks, following the army patrol at a safe distance. A chill ran down your spine, not from fear, but from the certainty that something important would happen on this day. The feathers of his spiritual protection swayed gently against his chest as he moved like shadow among the pine trees. The detachment led by Colonel Harrington advanced determinedly along the winding trail. 15 soldiers, all armed with new Springfield rifles that spat death with deadly accuracy. Lone Wolf knew these men and their weapons well. He had buried many brothers who underestimated his destructive power. In the center of the formation, Harrington rode with the rigid posture of someone who never doubted his decisions. Beside him, young Lieutenant Parker looked out of place, his restless eyes constantly scanning the hills, as if searching for something other than the enemy. "Colonel, the tracks indicate this group is small. Mostly women and children," Parker observed, his voice low enough that only Harrington could hear. "Your compassion for savages is touching, Lieutenant," the colonel replied dismissively. "But every Indian alive today is a dead soldier tomorrow. Remember that." Parker pursed his lips, holding back words that could cost him his career. He had chosen to serve in the West, believing in the ideals of progress and expansion, but the brutality he had witnessed since his arrival made him question the price of this advancement. Meanwhile, in the relative safety of Fort Abraham Lincoln, Catherine walked through the makeshift market where merchants offered wares to soldiers and their families, the smell of fresh bread mixed with that of tanned leather and tobacco. Her fingers slid over a necklace of colorful beads on one of the stalls. "Lakota work," the gray-bearded salesman explained, "found among the belongings of a group that, well, that no longer needed it." Catherine withdrew her hand as if the beads were on fire. The casualness with which the man spoke of an exterminated people deeply disturbed her. "It's hard to get used to, isn't it?" The female voice behind her belonged to Rebecca Miller, wife of the fort's doctor. "I came from the East like you 3 years ago. I'm still learning to live on the borders between two worlds." The two women exchanged a look of mutual understanding. Rebecca, in her 30s and with eyes that had already seen too much, offered Catherine something rare in this place: understanding without judgment. "Would you like to have tea with me? I have a small collection of native artifacts that you might be interested in. Many of them were healing objects that my husband studied." In the hills above the fort, Lone Wolf witnessed in horror what was happening in the small Lakota camp. Harrington's detachment had surrounded the few tents where some families were sheltering. They were survivors of a larger group, separated during the last escape. Elderly people, women and young children, just 2 young warriors to protect them. "Surrender or die," Harrington's voice thundered across the valley. One of the Lakota warriors stepped forward, hands raised in a sign of peace, speaking words in his language that Harrington completely ignored. What followed happened with brutal speed. A nervous soldier fired his rifle. The Lakota warrior fell. Screams, more shots. Parker shouting orders to cease fire. Too late. Lone Wolf clenched the stone in his hand until his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to remain hidden. Attacking now would mean certain death without purpose. His breath burned in his chest as he burned every face, every uniform, every act of cruelty into his memory. When the soldiers finally left, taking some prisoners, Lone Wolf went down to the devastated camp. Among the bodies, he found a girl of approximately 7 years old, breathing weakly, hidden under the body of her mother, who had died protecting her. "Wakantanka protected you, little one," he whispered, lifting her gently. "I'll take you to a safe place." The afternoon was falling when Catherine entered the fort's infirmary, carrying books that she had promised to lend to the doctor's wife. The smell of antiseptic and blood hit her like a wave. Soldiers wounded in previous skirmishes groaned in their beds, while others, newly arrived, were hurriedly tended to. "We massacred them all," a young soldier repeated in shock as Dr. Miller cleaned a cut on his forehead. "They weren't even armed, most of them." "Hush, Wilson," ordered the doctor, casting a nervous glance at Catherine. It was then that she saw Lieutenant Parker at the back of the room, his uniform stained with blood that clearly wasn't his. Their eyes met briefly, and Catherine saw something break in the soldier's expression. The fracture of a soul confronted with horrors it could not justify. Under cover of night, Lone Wolf crossed dangerous territories, carrying the little survivor. The stars above seemed silent witnesses to a senseless war. The girl, who he discovered was called Morning Star, clung to him with the strength of desperation. "Why do white men hate our people?" she asked in a barely audible whisper. Lone Wolf had no simple answer to offer. He just continued forward, knowing that his path and that of the blue-coated invaders would cross again. And when that happened, it wouldn't just be as a warrior, but as a bearer of a truth that few wanted to see. Meanwhile, at the fort, Catherine sat on the edge of her bed, her shaking hands unfolding a small local newspaper. The headline celebrated "Victory against hostile savages." The same operation that left Lieutenant Parker with haunted eyes and brought nightmarish screams to the infirmary was described as a necessary triumph of civilization. The truth she was beginning to realize was the first casualty of any war. 3 days after the massacre, Lone Wolf knelt before Elder Windsong, the tribe's spiritual leader. Between them, small flames danced in the sacred fire as the smell of sage and burning herbs purified the air around the tent. "The blue-coated man with fiery hair leads his people like wolves, lead sheep to a precipice," murmured the old shaman, his eyes clouded with age, but still piercing. "I see your restless spirit, Lone Wolf. You seek revenge." "I seek justice," the warrior replied, his voice firm despite the pain he carried. "Harrington must pay for the innocents he massacred." Little Morning Star slept in a corner of the tent, her sleep troubled by nightmares that no child should have. She was the only survivor of the attack, and Lone Wolf had sworn to protect her as if she were his own blood. "Justice has many paths." Windsong threw more herbs into the fire, making the flames crackle. "In my visions, I see you walking between 2 worlds, and I see a fair-skinned woman with fire in her heart and truth in her eyes." Lone Wolf frowned, confused. "A white woman? What part does she have in this story? The spirits don't show me everything, son. I just see that your destiny and hers are intertwined like the roots of the same oak. At the fort, Catherine spent hours in the small library, researching the Lakota and the peace agreements broken by the American government. Information was scarce and often distorted, but his sharp mind could read between the lines the story of a people whose land had been taken by force. "Interesting reading for a lady," observed Lieutenant Parker, appearing silently behind her. "Few here care about the history of the natives." Catherine closed the book, surprised by the officer's presence. Since the day of the massacre, he seemed to avoid her. "I believe that understanding your customs and beliefs could avoid unnecessary conflicts," he replied cautiously. "What happened at that camp? Was it really necessary?" Parker looked around, making sure they were alone before speaking in a low voice. "What happened was an atrocity, Miss Russell. Those people posed no threat." His eyes reflected the torment of someone who had witnessed horrors that contradicted everything he believed. "Harrington has his own interests in these lands, interests that go beyond his official orders." "What kind of interests?" The lieutenant hesitated, weighing the consequences of his words. "There are rumors about deals with miners. Gold has been found in the Black Hills, sacred lands to the Lakota." A noise at the door interrupted the conversation. Martha Russell hurried into the library, her face alight with excitement. "Kathy, dear, Colonel Harrington is hosting a ball to celebrate his recent victory. Isn't it wonderful? We need to get your dress ready." Catherine exchanged a meaningful look with Parker before following her aunt. The word victory now had a bitter taste in his mouth. The next morning, Lone Wolf advanced silently through the forest surrounding the fort. He wore white hunting clothes that he had obtained, with a hat pulled over his face to hide his native features. The risky strategy allowed him to approach the settlement without raising immediate suspicion. A group of hunters returned with provisions, and he mingled with them at the fort's entrance, imitating their movements and keeping his head down. Once inside, he headed to the stable, where he could observe without being noticed. It was there that he saw Catherine for the first time. She walked through the central courtyard with a book pressed to her chest, her blue dress contrasting with the dust and simplicity of the fort. There was something about her posture, a dignity mixed with genuine curiosity, that set her apart from the other white women he had observed. "The woman of visions," he muttered to himself, remembering the shaman's words. Catherine felt watched and turned towards the stable. For a brief moment, their eyes met, before Lone Wolf turned around, pretending to work with the horses. Something about that penetrating gaze deeply disturbed her. That afternoon, Colonel Harrington called a meeting of local merchants at his cabin. Among them was Joseph Miller, a fur trader with a dubious reputation. "The gold veins in the northern hills are richer than we imagined," Miller reported, spreading maps on the table. "But we need to act quickly before Washington decides to honor the treaty with the savages." Harrington smiled, running his fingers through his gray mustaches. "Washington is thousands of miles from here, Miller, and as long as I command this fort, those lands will be ours." "What about the remaining Lakota?" "Leave it to me. After the next attack I am planning, no Indian will dare remain in the Black Hills." What none of them knew was that Morning Star, guided by Lone Wolf, was observing the scene through a small crack in the back window. The girl, despite her young age, understood enough of the white people's language to understand the threat. And now she would be the ears and voice of her people. At nightfall, as preparations for the ball began at the fort, two souls separated by different worlds gazed at the same starry sky. Catherine from her window, questioning everything she believed she knew about civilization and savagery, and Lone Wolf in the shadows beyond the stockade, planning his next move on a board where his people always started at a disadvantage. Fate brought them closer every moment, like storm clouds converging on the Dakota horizon. The ball at Fort Abraham Lincoln transformed the austere dining hall into an impromptu ballroom. Kerosene lanterns hung from the ceiling, creating a golden glow over the tables set aside to make room for dancing. Officers in impeccable uniforms and their wives in starched dresses circulated among merchants, local politicians, and landowners. Catherine watched everything with increasing discomfort. Her navy blue dress, the best she had brought from Boston, seemed to suffocate her as she tried to reconcile the joy around her with the revelations of the last few days. "My dear, you look absolutely stunning," said Colonel Harrington, approaching with 2 glasses of punch. "Everyone is talking about Martha Russell's beautiful niece." "Thank you, Colonel," Catherine replied, accepting the drink. "I confess that I find it difficult to celebrate after recent events." Harrington's eyes hardened briefly, but his smile remained intact. "Ah, the feminine sensitivity. It is understandable that the needs of expansion seem brutal to one raised in the comforts of the East, but I assure you that every action is necessary to bring civilization to these wild lands." From across the room, Lieutenant Parker watched the interaction, his hands clenching his glass with barely concealed tension. Beside him, Dr. Miller commented quietly, "Harrington is spinning his web around Miss Russell. A shame. She seems to have more intelligence than most." "She does," Parker replied, "and I hope this keeps you safe." Outside the fort's walls, Lone Wolf moved with the precision of a predator. The celebrations had reduced vigilance, allowing him and 2 young warriors to approach undetected. They did not come to attack, but to observe and obtain information. "They dance while our people mourn their dead," murmured Swiftbird, one of the warriors, his voice thick with bitterness. "The woman in blue," Lone Wolf pointed to Catherine through a window. "She's different." "All are equal," replied Swiftbird. "Their hearts are cold as stones." Lone Wolf didn't respond. Something about the woman's posture, the way her eyes followed the colonel suspiciously, intrigued him. Winsong's words echoed in her mind, a fair-skinned woman with fire in her heart. Inside the room, the improvised orchestra began a waltz, and Harrington led Catherine to the center of the dance floor. His large hands gripped her waist too tightly. "I hear you've been visiting our little library often," commented the colonel as they whirled around. "Did you find something that interests you?" Catherine measured her words carefully. "I'm curious about the native people of this region, their stories, traditions. An academic interest, I presume. It is good to keep such studies to books only. Real savages are dangerous and unpredictable creatures. Like the family your detail found 3 days ago?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Harrington stopped abruptly, his fingers tightening on Catherine's arm. "I see that Lieutenant Parker has been communicative, an error in judgment that will be corrected." The colonel's gaze was icy, making Catherine realize the danger her question posed, not only to her, but to Parker. "Forgive my misplaced curiosity," he tried to remedy. "It's just that the stories I hear are so contradictory. The only truth you need to know, my dear, is that we are bringing progress to a wild land. Any obstacle to that progress will be removed." His smile returned, more threatening than reassuring. "Now, let us continue our dance." Outside, Lone Wolf observed the changing dynamic between the two. The tension was palpable even from a distance. "We must go," whispered Swiftbird. "The patrol is approaching." But Lone Wolf remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the woman in blue. There was something in her expression, a mix of fear and determination, that made him want to understand more. When the dance ended, Catherine apologized, saying she needed fresh air. He escaped to the building's side porch, where the shadows offered a brief respite from the suffocating festivities. His hands shook as he tried to regain his composure. "He's more dangerous than he looks," said a soft voice from behind her. Catherine whirled around, alarmed, to find Rebecca Miller emerging from the shadows. "You scared me." "I apologize, but I saw your face during the dance with Harrington." Rebecca approached, speaking in urgent whispers. "My husband found documents, plans for an all-out offensive against the remaining Lakota. A final solution, as he calls it." "Why?" Catherine asked, her heart racing. "Gold. The Black Hills are full of it. Harrington has secret deals with miners and investors back east. The first shipment leaves in 3 days." The revelation left Catherine stunned. "What can we do?" "Nothing openly. Any suspicion would put us in danger." Rebecca hesitated. "But there is a man, a Lakota, who occasionally supplies my husband with medicinal herbs. If we could warn him." In the shadows beyond the porch, Lone Wolf absorbed every word of the conversation. His suspicion about the woman in blue was confirmed. She did not share Harrington's cruelty. Maybe she was the ally her people needed. The night wore on, and with it, the seeds of an unlikely alliance began to germinate. On one side, a Boston professor discovering that the boundaries between civilization and savagery were much more nebulous than she had ever imagined. On the other, a Lakota warrior, realizing that not all Wasichu shared their leader's bloodlust. Between them, the sacred Black Hills waited, silent witnesses to a battle that would transcend rifles and arrows, a battle for truth in a land built on lies. In the darkness before dawn, Catherine sat by the window of her small room in the fort, her hands shaking as she carefully folded a piece of paper. The conversation with Rebecca Miller the night before had planted a seed of rebellion in his heart. Harrington's plans for a final solution against the Lakota could not be ignored. Outside, the fort began to awaken with the first sounds of the stables and the bugle call announcing the changing of the guard. Catherine slipped the note into her pocket and took a deep breath, preparing herself for what she was about to do. "Just a morning walk," he rehearsed in a low voice. "Nothing more than a walk to see the surroundings." Lone Wolf waited patiently in the shadows of the forest surrounding the fort, his silhouette almost indistinguishable among the pine trees. The conversation he had witnessed the night before remained vivid in his mind. The woman in the blue dress could be an ally or a trap. He wasn't sure, but something compelled him to take a risk. "The white man in the blue coat plans a big attack," reported Passero Veloz, who accompanied him. "We need to warn our people." "Why do we wait then?" questioned the young warrior impatiently. "Because there is more to learn," Lone Wolf replied, his eyes fixed on the fort's gate. "And because the spirit of a woman speaks the truth, even if she doesn't know it yet." The golden light of the rising sun began to bathe the hills when Catherine walked out of the fort's gates, riding a gentle mare. He had convinced the stablemaster that he needed exercise and fresh air, casually mentioning that Dr. Miller's wife had recommended morning rides for weakened female nerves. His heart pounded violently against his chest as he walked away from the fort, following the trail Rebecca had described. If she were discovered, not only would her reputation be ruined, but her life would possibly be at risk. Harrington wouldn't tolerate betrayal, especially from a woman. After about 20 minutes of riding, Catherine came to a small clearing where a stream meandered between mossy rocks. He dismounted slowly, looking around with apprehension. "Hello?" he called hesitantly, his voice little more than a whisper. "Dr. Miller sent me." Silence responded, broken only by the chirping of birds and the murmur of water. Catherine felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. What if I had been tricked? What if this was a trap? "You're brave for a white woman," came the voice from behind her, soft but firm. Catherine turned quickly, almost losing her balance. Lone Wolf was standing a few meters away, wearing clothes that mixed native and settler elements. His long black hair was partially covered by a leather hat, but his eyes, deep and penetrating, were unmistakably Lakota. "You," she breathed, recognizing the man she had seen briefly in the stables. "You were watching." "As you observe," he replied, his English clear but accented. "You see beyond Firecoat's lies." "Firecoat? The man you call Harrington?" Catherine nodded, regaining her composure. He took the folded note from his pocket and held it out with a trembling hand. "Dr. Miller found this among the Colonel's documents. A plan to attack your camp in 2 days. They know where you are." Lone Wolf took the paper, his fingers briefly brushing hers. A simple contact that, even so, made them both look at each other for a moment longer than necessary. "Why do you help my people?" he asked, studying her face. "Because—" Catherine hesitated, searching for words for a feeling that was still forming inside her. "Because what's happening is wrong. Because I came to the West believing in progress and civilization, but what I saw was just greed disguised as duty." Lone Wolf kept the note in his leather tunic. "My people tell stories about spirits being born in the wrong place," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Maybe your soul should have been born Lakota." The comment, although strange, touched Catherine in an inexplicable way. Before he could respond, the distant sound of horses' hooves broke the moment. "You need to go," warned Lone Wolf, his expression turning serious. "They can't find her here." "How can I help again?" Catherine asked quickly, already moving towards her mare. "The sun sets twice and then I return." "Same place." He retreated into the shadows of the forest. "Be careful, sky-eyed woman. Not all enemies wear feathers." With those words, he disappeared into the trees as if he had never been there. Catherine hurriedly mounted and turned her mare back onto the trail, forcing herself to ride at a casual pace, despite her growing panic. He found the morning patrol halfway to the fort, led by Lieutenant Parker. The relief on his face at seeing her was quickly replaced by concern. "Miss Russell, it's dangerous to ride alone in these parts." "Forgive me, Lieutenant," she smiled, hoping he wouldn't notice her nervousness. "The morning was so inviting that I couldn't resist a little walk." Parker nodded, but his eyes communicated a silent warning. "Allow me to escort you back to the fort." As they rode side by side, Catherine couldn't forget the look in Lone Wolf's eyes, or the way he spoke, with a dignity and intelligence that contradicted everything she'd been told about savages. In just one brief encounter, their certainties about the world had been profoundly shaken. At the fort, Colonel Harrington watched his arrival from his office window, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Beside him, a map of the Black Hills was marked with red circles, locations of Lakota camps slated for destruction. "Watch Martha's niece," he instructed a subordinate. "Every movement, every conversation. There's something about her that I don't like." The wheel of destiny now turned faster, bringing 3 souls together in a dangerous dance, where every false step could mean destruction. Dawn at the fort brought with it a sweltering heat that foreshadowed another scorching day in Dakota. Catherine awoke before the bugle sounded, her thoughts stirred by the memory of her encounter with Lone Wolf. Through the window, he observed soldiers changing the guard, people lighting fires for breakfast, and traders arranging goods on makeshift stands. 2 days had passed since their secret meeting, and today she would return to that same spot. The expectation made his heart beat wildly, not just because of the danger, but because of something deeper that he still couldn't name. "You're up early," commented Martha, entering the room with a tray of tea. "Colonel Harrington asked if you would accompany him on an afternoon stroll." Catherine felt an unpleasant shiver. "I'm afraid you already have other plans. I promised to help Rebecca Miller organize medical supplies. Martha frowned. You've been avoiding the Colonel. He's a good catch, Catherine, a respected man. Respect earned at the cost of how much blood? Catherine muttered to herself, but smiled politely at her aunt. I just need time to adapt to this place. Meanwhile, 10 miles from the fort, Lone Wolf was preparing to meet Catherine. The Lakota camp had been moved to the valley, hidden behind the Oak Mountains, thanks to the warning she had sent. When Harrington sent his troops to the original location, they found only cold ash. Trusting a white woman is like trusting a hungry coyote, warned Swiftbird, watching Lone Wolf gather documents he had obtained from traders sympathetic to the Indian cause. This is different, replied Lone Wolf, tying up his long hair. There is an ancient prophecy that speaks of a spirit divided between two worlds that would bring change. And you believe that this blue-eyed woman is that spirit? Lone Wolf didn't respond, but his thoughts were fixed on Catherine's determined expression, on the courage that emanated from her like heat from a campfire. Something inexplicable drew him to her, as if their souls recognized each other from another life. At the fort, Catherine was helping Rebecca sort medicinal herbs when Lieutenant Parker entered the infirmary, his face serious. Miss Russell, may I speak to you in private? Outside the infirmary, Parker lowered his voice. I have reason to believe you are being watched. Harrington suspects something. Catherine's heart quickened. Suspicious of what exactly? That you sympathize with the natives. He hesitated, and perhaps I'm right. I've seen how you react to stories of attacks, with genuine horror, not with satisfaction like others. And what is your position, Lieutenant? I am torn between my duty and my conscience. His eyes reflected the torment within. But I can no longer pretend that what we do here is honorable. Catherine studied his face, assessing whether she could trust him. If someone had information that could prevent a massacre, would you help? A long silence fell between them, before Parker nodded discreetly. Be careful today, he whispered. 2 men will follow you when you leave the fort. The lieutenant's warning changed Catherine's plans. With ingenuity, she managed to lose the guards using the confusion in the market as cover. Rebecca helped her, creating a distraction by faking a feint that attracted the guards. When Catherine finally reached the clearing on the banks of the stream, her heart was beating violently. The surrounding forest seemed too silent, until Lone Wolf emerged from the shadows like a spirit. You came, he said, relief evident in his voice. I was followed, but I managed to lose them. Catherine caught her breath. We have little time. Lone Wolf approached, offering him a canteen of water. Your people are safe, thanks to you. Harrington sent soldiers, but they only found an abandoned camp. A small smile touched Catherine's lips. I'm happy. But he won't give up. No, he won't give up. Lone Wolf took handwritten documents from his bag. We found this in the things of a drunken merchant. These are orders from Washington denying Harrington permission to attack our people. He hid these orders. Catherine looked over the documents, her eyes widening. This is treason against the government itself. He is disobeying direct orders. And this, continued Lone Wolf, showing a map, shows the gold mines that he and his partners have already begun to explore in Lakota territory against the signed treaty. A gentle breeze ruffled their hair as they stood close, examining the evidence. Catherine's lavender scent mixed with the scent of sage that permeated Lone Wolf's clothes. We need to turn this over to the authorities, muttered Catherine. Prove that Harrington acts on his own, against Washington's orders. Who would believe us? A Lakota warrior and a woman. Their eyes met, and Catherine felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't just the conspiracy that brought them together now, but something deeper, as if fate had intertwined their lives for some greater purpose. "Lieutenant Parker would help," she said finally. "He's questioning Harrington's orders. Trusting another man in a blue coat is dangerous. Sometimes we need to trust to survive." A distant sound of breaking branches made them both tense up. Lone Wolf quickly put away the documents. "Someone is approaching," he whispered. "You must go." "When will we meet again?" "Next new moon, at the abandoned cabin near the Cumberland River." Lone Wolf hesitated, then took Catherine's hand in both of his. "Be careful, sky-eyed Catherine. You carry not only our secrets, but the hope of my people." Their fingers intertwined briefly before he disappeared into the forest. Catherine remained still for a moment, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, before mounting and riding back to the fort, aware that she had crossed a line from which she could not return. On the horizon, dark clouds began to form, foreshadowing not only a natural storm, but also the approaching storm at Fort Abraham Lincoln, where buried secrets threatened to surface with devastating consequences for everyone. The flood of the Cumberland River delayed the expected meeting between Catherine and Lone Wolf. 3 days of continuous rain had turned the region into an impassable quagmire, isolating the fort and the indigenous camps scattered across the hills. In the cramped room of her cabin, Catherine watched through the fogged window the movement of soldiers facing the mud of the central courtyard. Her thoughts, however, wandered to the abandoned cabin near the river and to the man who was possibly waiting for her there. "Miss Russell, how nice to meet you." Colonel Harrington's deep voice startled her. He entered without announcing, shaking the water off his hat and coat. "This endless rain grants us rare moments of tranquility." "Colonel," Catherine replied coldly, keeping her distance, "I wasn't expecting visitors." Harrington smiled, his calculating eyes scanning the room and landing on a small map hidden partially beneath a book. "I've noticed your absence from our social gatherings. I'm beginning to think you avoid my company. Work in the infirmary with Mrs. Miller has been taking up my time." "Ah, yes, Rebecca Miller, a curious woman." Harrington approached, the smell of whiskey and cigarettes invading Catherine's personal space. "Did you know that her husband maintains regular correspondence with Indian sympathetic groups in Washington?" Catherine's heart sped up, but she kept her expression neutral. "It doesn't surprise me that a doctor would care about the well-being of all human beings." "Human beings?" Harrington laughed dryly. "An interesting definition for savages who attack settlements and massacre innocent settlers. Like the camp of women and children your detachment found weeks ago?" The colonel's smile disappeared. In one swift movement, he grabbed Catherine's wrist with enough force to leave bruises. "Watch your words, miss. Unaccompanied women at the border face many dangers." He released her abruptly and headed for the door. "By the way, we found interesting tracks near Cumberland Creek. Apparently someone has been making regular visits to that area. Curious coincidence." When the door closed, Catherine felt her legs weaken. Harrington knew, or strongly suspected, of their encounters. "I needed to warn Lone Wolf about the danger." In the abandoned cabin, Lone Wolf waited patiently, protected from the rain that drummed on the precarious roof. The small building that had served as a hunter's outpost now offered the perfect refuge for his secret meetings with Catherine. Behind him, Swiftbird remained alert, suspicious. "She won't come in this rain," said the young warrior. "Maybe it will never come again." "She'll come when she can," replied Lone Wolf, his eyes fixed on the muddy trail. "Her spirit is as strong as a Lakota warrior. The feelings I see in your eyes when you talk about her are also strong." Swiftbird studied his friend with concern. "The elders warn against mixing blood. It only brings suffering." The elders also teach that each soul finds its match regardless of the skin that covers it. A noise outside the cabin interrupted the conversation. They both positioned themselves, weapons ready, but instead of Catherine, it was Lieutenant Parker who appeared in the doorway, soaked and panting. "I come in Catherine's name," he announced, raising his hands in a sign of peace. "Harrington watches her. It's not safe for her to leave the fort." Lone Wolf slowly lowered his rifle, assessing the soldier. "Why should we trust you, man in the blue coat?" "Because I also despise what Harrington stands for." Parker took damp documents from his pocket, and he brought proof of his betrayal. The papers revealed Harrington's detailed plans for a major attack against the main Lakota camps, taking advantage of the dispersal caused by the rains. The operation was scheduled to take place in 2 days. "Catherine suggested a plan," Parker continued. "Harrington will hold a meeting tomorrow with the miners. If we get hard evidence of their illegal dealings, we can send it to the commander of Fort Laramie, who reports directly to Washington." Lone Wolf studied the lieutenant for a long moment. "You risk your position and your life." "Some principles are worth more than life," Parker replied, "or a military career." After the lieutenant's departure, Swiftbird expressed his distrust. "It could be a trap." "Yes," agreed Lone Wolf, "but it may also be our only chance to save our people." The next morning, as the rain finally eased, Catherine walked through the fort with apparent tranquility, although her mind was racing with worry. As he passed the command headquarters, he noticed unusual movement, carts unloading heavy boxes under the discreet supervision of Joseph Miller, the merchant. "New rifles," Rebecca whispered, approaching casually, "and enough ammunition for a small war." Did Parker manage to contact Lone Wolf? "Yes, everything is ready for tonight." Catherine felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the persistent dampness. "What about the mine documents?" "In Harrington's office, locked in the desk." Rebecca hesitated. "Catherine, if we are discovered—" "I know the risks." Catherine discreetly shook her friend's hand. "But I can't stand by while innocent people are slaughtered out of greed." In the afternoon, as the traders and officers gathered in the command room, Catherine put her plan into action. Dressed as a kitchen assistant, she infiltrated the main building. The empty hallway led directly to Harrington's office, but as he turned the corner, he found a guard posted at the door. His mind worked quickly. Leaning suggestively over the tray he was carrying, he offered the young soldier a steaming mug. "Hot coffee, soldier. Cold night to keep watch." The man smiled, accepting the drink without suspecting the laudanum that Rebecca had mixed into the drink. Within minutes he was nodding in his chair. With shaking hands, Catherine used the keys Parker had obtained to open the room. The desk revealed its treasure trove, contracts between Harrington and miners, detailed maps of illegal mines in Lakota territory, and letters ignoring direct orders from Washington. Everything they needed to expose the betrayal. As she quickly copied the most important documents, a sound of boots in the hallway stopped her. Voices approached. One of them, Harrington's unmistakably authoritative intonation. Catherine put the papers in her bodice, closed the drawer, and looked around desperately. The window was his only exit. Without hesitation, he leapt into the gathering darkness, landing in the mud with an impact that stole his breath. Creeping into the shadows between the buildings, she heard the alarm sound in the fort. A furious scream rang out. Harrington had discovered the invasion. Catherine ran to the stable, where Parker was waiting for her as agreed. With no time for explanations, they mounted and galloped into the night, heading to the meeting point where Lone Wolf waited. Behind them, the fort became a busy anthill. Lanterns swung in the darkness as soldiers hurriedly mounted. The hunt had begun, and the danger they faced went beyond simple desertion. It was a race against death, where the prize would be the truth. And perhaps, if they survived, a future for the people of Lone Wolf. The horses' hooves cut through the mud as Catherine and Parker rode through the night, the darkness swallowing their tracks. The light rain that fell seemed to conspire in their favor, making the work of their pursuers, who would certainly come after them, more difficult. Catherine clutched the documents that could change the fate of hundreds of lives to her chest, feeling the damp paper against her skin. "We have to get to the creek before dawn," Parker shouted into the wind. "If Harrington catches up to us in this open territory, we won't stand a chance." Catherine just nodded, her hands tight on the reins, fear and adrenaline keeping her alert despite her exhaustion. This was no longer the refined teacher from Boston. The frontier had transformed her into something more, something stronger and more determined than she ever imagined she could become. In the distance, the distant sound of a bugle tore through the night. The fort was mobilizing all available men. "They'll come in full force," Parker muttered, his face tense. "Harrington cannot afford to let these documents reach Fort Laramie." After almost 2 hours of riding, they finally saw the silhouette of the large rocks that marked the entrance to the territory of the hills. Catherine felt her heart skip a beat as a figure emerged from the shadows, materializing like a spirit. Lone Wolf, riding his painted horse, his dark eyes glowing in the darkness. "Quickly!" he called, gesturing for them to follow him along a barely visible trail through the trees. "Bluecoats have already passed through the East Valley. They are surrounding it." The three galloped through dense pine forests, following paths known only to the Lakota. The smell of pine trees and wet earth surrounded them as they climbed higher and higher into the hills. When they finally stopped to rest the horses in a small cave, Catherine could barely stand. "Let me see the documents," said Lone Wolf, lighting a small fire protected from outside view by the rock formations. Catherine handed him the papers carefully. Their hands touched briefly, and even in that moment of danger, a current of electricity coursed through their body. Lone Wolf's eyes met yours, communicating more than words could express. "These prove everything." Parker examined the documents with Lone Wolf. Harrington disobeyed direct orders, sold weapons illegally, and planned mass murders for financial benefit. As a result, Washington will have no choice but to intervene. "If we get to Fort Laramie," observed Lone Wolf, folding the papers. The silence that followed was heavy with the reality they faced. Harrington had over 30 men at his disposal. There were only 3 of them. "There is a way," Lone Wolf said finally, drawing a line on a small map he had drawn in the dirt. "Through Spirit Canyon. White people avoid it for fear of the legends. Lakota ghosts are said to devour souls there." "And they devour?" Catherine asked, a slight smile on her lips despite her tiredness. "Only the unclean ones," replied Lone Wolf, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that warmed her face, even in the cold night. Parker watched the silent exchange between the two, recognition growing in his eyes. "We will rest for 2 hours. Then we will continue before dawn." While Parker stood guard at the cave entrance, Catherine sat next to the small fire, her hands outstretched for warmth. Lone Wolf sat next to him, their shoulders almost touching. "Why do you risk so much for my people?" he asked softly. "Your world would be easier if you had simply stayed at the fort." Catherine stared at the flames for a long moment before responding. "When I came to the West, I believed in stories about civilization and progress. Now I see that true savagery wears uniforms and carries official orders." "And you're not afraid?" "Constantly," she smiled. "But my father used to say that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it." Distant thunder reverberated across the hills, heralding more rain. Catherine shivered involuntarily, the cold penetrating her still damp clothes. Wordlessly, Lone Wolf wrapped his fur blanket around her, his arms remaining around her in a gesture that went beyond simple warmth. "Among my people," he said softly. "When two spirits recognize each other, We say they have traveled together in many previous lives. Catherine looked at him, the proximity making her heart almost painfully quicken. And you believe that? I don't think I've ever felt for anyone what I feel when I'm with you, Catherine of the Sky Eyes. The moment was full of possibilities, of divergent and converging paths, of worlds colliding. Slowly, as if moved by a force beyond their control, their faces came closer. Lone Wolf's lips met hers in a kiss as soft as it was deep, a silent promise, an oath sealed without words. When they separated, they remained with their foreheads together, breathing the same air, sharing the same uncertain destiny. If we survive this, Catherine whispered, there is no place for us in either world. Then we will create our own world, he replied, his fingers delicately tracing the line of her face. Between mountains and valleys, between heaven and earth. The rain began to fall more heavily outside, but inside the cave, something was blooming against all odds, a love that defied borders, prejudices, and the very bloody history that separated them. At dawn, they would face an army determined to silence them. But that night, for a few precious hours, they found refuge not only from Harrington's bullets, but also from the divisions the world had forced between them. The early morning darkness was beginning to give way to the first rays of sunlight when Catherine, Lone Wolf, and Parker left the safety of the cave. The gorge of spirit stretched out before them, a narrow path between rocky walls that seemed to touch the sky. The morning fog formed a ghostly curtain between the formations, justifying the legends that haunted the white men. The spirits are restless today, murmured Lone Wolf, watching the low clouds that snaked between the rocks. They feel the blood that could be spilled. Catherine adjusted the documents in her leather bag and instinctively touched the locket she carried with her, a gift from her mother that now seemed like a talisman against the danger that surrounded them. The night before had changed something fundamental within her. The kiss shared with Lone Wolf was not just a moment of comfort in the midst of chaos, but a silent promise, a commitment that transcended worlds. "We will ride single file," Parker instructed, checking his pistol. "The gorge is too narrow for us to go side by side. I'll go in front, Catherine in the middle, and you bring up the rear," he said, looking at Lone Wolf. The Lakota warrior nodded, his dark eyes scanning the distant hills where there was movement. Harrington patrols, searching for them, no doubt. Time was against them. They entered the gorge to the sound of hooves echoing against the stone walls. The temperature dropped immediately, as if they had entered another world. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of moss. Catherine shivered, not from the cold, but from the palpable sensation of being watched. "The stories say that Lakota warriors were trapped here by soldiers," Lone Wolf explained, his low voice reverberating off the rock walls. "They preferred to jump to their deaths rather than surrender. Their spirits still guard this place." "And will they protect us?" asked Catherine, looking up at the heights where the wind seemed to whisper in an unknown language. "If our hearts are pure," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that transcended words. Parker led them deeper into the canyon, where the path narrowed so much that they almost had to dismount. Sunlight barely penetrated between the high walls, creating a world of shadows and filtered light. After almost an hour of tense riding, the gorge began to widen, revealing a small hidden valley with a crystal-clear stream meandering through the vegetation. "We can stop here so the horses can drink," Parker suggested. "Fort Laramie is less than half a day's ride if we keep a good pace." As they rested briefly, Catherine watched Lone Wolf kneel at the edge of the stream, his hands cupping the water. He muttered words in Lakota, a prayer or thanks, before drinking. There was a dignity in his every gesture that fascinated her, as if every movement, every breath, were part of a larger dance with the world around him. "What will happen to your people when we hand over the documents?" she asked, approaching him. "If the men in Washington will honor their words, perhaps we will have peace for a while," replied Lone Wolf, rising to his feet. "But the hunger for gold is stronger than honor for many white men. Not everyone is like Harrington," she insisted, gently touching his arm. "No," he agreed, his fingers finding hers. "Some have hearts as big as the plains." The intimate moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hooves, lots of hooves, approaching quickly. "They found us," Parker warned, drawing his gun. "They must have taken another route to intercept us at the exit of the gorge." Lone Wolf quickly guided them behind a rock formation that offered some protection. "There is a secondary trail that goes up the hillside," he indicated. "It's narrow, but it will take us to a plateau from where we can reach Fort Laramie by another route." "You guys will," Parker decided, checking his ammunition. "I delay them here." "No," protested Catherine. "They will kill him." "One man can make this point long enough," Parker insisted, a sad smile on his face. "Besides, a deserter is already doomed. My death better have meaning." The looks they exchanged communicated more than words could express. Parker had found his redemption in this last act of courage. "My people will sing your name in stories," promised Lone Wolf, squeezing the lieutenant's shoulder. "Take care of her," Parker replied, "and make sure those documents get into the right hands." With a heavy heart, Catherine allowed Lone Wolf to guide her onto the upward path. When they were halfway up the slope, they heard the first shots echoing through the canyon. Parker had engaged their pursuers. "He buys us time," murmured Lone Wolf, helping Catherine up a particularly steep section. "Your courage will be remembered." They reached the plateau, just as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. From there they could see the vastness of the Dakotas stretching out in all directions, the golden plains, the lush green hills, and in the distance the smoke that indicated the location of Fort Laramie. "So close," Catherine whispered, feeling the exhaustion weigh on her limbs. A lone gunshot echoed in the distance, followed by a silence that spoke 1,000 words. Parker had made his last stand. "Come on," said Lone Wolf, his face a mask of determination. "We cannot let your sacrifice be in vain." They rode side by side across the plateau, their hearts united not only by shared mission, but by a bond that defied all conventions of their worlds. Behind them, the chase continued. Ahead, the hope of justice, and between them, an unlikely love blooming like a wildflower among the rocks. Resilient, unexpected, and extraordinarily beautiful. The sound of Fort Laramie's bugles echoed across the fields as Catherine and Lone Wolf rode through the main gate. The American flag fluttered under the clear Dakota sky, a contrast to the stormy clouds that chased them from the canyon. Soldiers rushed to intercept them, rifles trained on the Lakota warrior. "This man is under my protection," declared Catherine, rising into the saddle with an authority that surprised even herself. "I demand to see Commander Wilson immediately. I bring documents of national importance." Something in his gaze, perhaps the determination of someone who had faced death and returned, made the soldiers hesitate. A lieutenant named Richardson intervened, recognizing Catherine's name from previous telegrams. "Miss Russell, we were informed that you were missing, and possibly," he hesitated, "corrupted by wild influences." "The only corruption is in Fort Abraham Lincoln," she replied, dismounting with legs shaking from exhaustion. "And we have the evidence here." 4 hours later, Commander Wilson's office was buzzing with activity. Telegraphic messages were sent to Washington at a frantic pace, while officials studied in disbelief the documents presented by the unlikely couple. "Treason, fraud, premeditated murder," muttered Wilson, an older man whose military experience had not prepared him for such a level of corruption. "Harrington will be tried in military court, I assure you of that." Lone Wolf remained silent for most of the meeting, his watchful gaze studying every reaction, every nuance of the military's body language. Years of betrayal had taught him to distrust white promises. "Will the lands of the Black Hills be protected then?" he finally asked, his deep voice cutting through the hustle and bustle of the room. "And will my people be able to live in peace, as guaranteed by the treaties?" Wilson sighed, looking at the warrior with an honesty rare in relations between military and natives. "I can guarantee that Harrington's actions will be punished and the illegal mines closed. But I cannot promise that the greed of men will not find other paths in the future." Lone Wolf nodded, understanding the truth between the lines. A battle won was not the same as a war ended. In the small room reserved for them that night, Catherine fell exhausted into the chair as Lone Wolf watched the sunset through the narrow window. Parker's sacrifice still weighed heavily on their hearts. "What will happen now?" she asked, undoing the braid that tied up her hair. "I will ride tomorrow to bring the news to my people," he replied. "They need to know that they are temporarily safe." Catherine felt a tightness in her chest. "And after that?" Lone Wolf turned to her, his face illuminated by the last golden ray of the setting sun. "That's up to you, sky-eyed Catherine." "From me?" "Among my people there is a story about souls finding each other through many lifetimes," he approached, kneeling before her. "When we recognize them, we have two choices: honor the bond or deny it and continue wandering apart until the next life." Catherine touched his face, tracing with her fingers the lines of his face that she had grown to love. "My world would reject me if I chose you. And many of my people would view me with suspicion for choosing a white woman," he agreed. "We would be between worlds, belonging completely to neither." "Maybe that's precisely where we're supposed to be," she whispered. "On the border between worlds, building something new." The next morning they rode out of Fort Laramie together. A military detachment accompanied them to the border of Lakota lands, where dozens of warriors waited, tense but hopeful. "You must continue alone from here," Catherine said, understanding protocol. "Your people need to hear from you first." Lone Wolf took her hands in his. "I will return in 7 days, when the moon is full again. If you are at the cabin on the Cumberland River, I will know your answer. If you are not—" His voice trailed off slightly. "I will understand too." The silence between them held all the unspoken words, all the obstacles, fears, and hopes of an uncertain future. 7 days passed with agonizing slowness. Catherine waited at Fort Laramie as the news came in fragments. Harrington had been arrested, illegal mines were being closed, a new treaty was being drafted in Washington. On the appointed night, she rode alone to the cabin, carrying only the essentials. The Cumberland River flowed serenely in the moonlight, its silvery surface reflecting the full moon that hung imposingly in the Dakota sky. Hours passed with no sign of him. Doubts began to assail her. Perhaps her people had convinced her of the madness of that union, perhaps. The sound of hooves interrupted his thoughts. Lone Wolf appeared in the clearing, dismounting with the feline grace she so admired. "You came," he said simply, relief evident in his voice. "Did you doubt?" "Never from your heart, only from the world that tries to separate us." Catherine walked up to him, no longer hesitating or afraid. "What world would that be? Yours? Mine? None of them really belong to us now." Lone Wolf smiled, taking her in his arms. "Then we will build our own world, as promised. Between the mountains and the valleys, between the sky and the earth." Under the witness of the stars and the sacred hills, their lips met in a kiss that sealed not only an unlikely love, but an alliance between cultures that the world was not yet prepared to understand. The future would be uncertain, often dangerous, but they would face it together. Two spirits finally reunited, navigating the borders between worlds that, one day, might learn to coexist. And so, in the vastness of Dakota, where the wind carried ancient stories and new promises, began a journey that transcended history itself. A testament that love, in its purest form, recognizes no man-made boundaries.